I want to welcome everybody to this talk on behalf of the Sawyer Seminars. Kevin Hewison from the Department of Asian Studies and the director of the Carolina Asia Center. He's on leave this semester. But the interim director is sitting over there, Michael Shin. But we're putting on this year-and-a-half long program called Precarious Work in Asia. And we're delighted today to have Ching Kwan Lee visit us. She's a professor of sociology at UCLA. She has published a number of books on labor in China. She grew up in Hong Kong and has taught there. Went to graduate school at Berkeley and got her PhD there. And that's where she honed her ethnographic skills and developed and expanded her love for studying labor by working with Michael Burrowoy, among others. She did a dissertation on gender and work in China. And then the reading group has read a terrific book by her called Against the Law, which involved field work in 2 regions in China. As Chinese capital has moved away from China, she has followed it and is continuing to study it. And one of the places where labor has gone is Africa. Today she's going to talk about her field work in Zambia. So welcome to Chapel Hill, CK.
Thank you, Arnie, for contextualizing what I'm going to talk about today here, and thank you for coming. I know it's a Friday, and if we were in UCLA, there'll be nobody. Let me jump right in because I like to have more time for discussion. This probably is the question that most people have come today have in mind when you see the title, China in Africa. And the question that has been suggested to us in the Western media is whether China is a new colonial power in Africa. And I'd like to put this question aside from the very beginning because I don't think this is a very productive kind of question to ask. And the reason is their argument is very simplistic and is totally based on the idea that China has invested an enormous amount of money in Africa. The quantity of capital is the basis for them to argue or to even to ponder whether we're seeing a new colonial power. And I think this is a very simplistic view to understand colonialism because it omits 2 important contexts. The first context is that if you look at Chinese capital investment globally, then Africa does not even make it to the top 3 or 4 regions of the world. And by country, these are the country top destinations for Chinese capital. And the US will be ahead of many African countries. And we've never said that China is colonialist in the United States. So I think what you hear in the media really have ignored 2 important contexts. The second context that it has omitted was that actually in Africa, since the 1990s, after waves of structural adjustment programs imposed by the World Bank and the IMF, Africa has become very globalized because many of these state-owned enterprises were forced to become private, and therefore foreign investors came to Africa to run those mines and oil companies. And so if you look at Africa itself, it has become so globalized, and China is only one amongst many investors. So to say that anybody who invests in Africa is a colonial power really, it doesn't mean a lot. You basically remove the most critical edge of that concept. So I want you to sort of put that question aside and maybe entertain other kinds of questions as we observe Chinese developments in Africa. The second kind of discourse that you hear a lot if you go to Africa these days, or sometimes you hear it in the newspapers here, is that there is a labor problem involved with Chinese capitalism in Africa. And if you go to Africa, you'll hear people complaining a lot. And one of the major complaints you'll hear is that the Chinese are the worst employers. They are the worst in the sense that they exploit workers to an extent that other foreign investors would not appear to be doing. Now, so labor is a very explosive issue, and they always would point to, for example, in Zambia, which my research is where I do my research. 2005, there was a very deadly explosion in a Chinese copper mine that killed 50 people, all of them Zambian workers. Just last year, some of you might have heard, there was a shooting incident where when Zambian workers went to their Chinese managers and demanding higher wages, these guys just shot them. And 2 people were injured. There were 13 workers were injured, 2 very seriously. And also in Zambia, there is a very anti-Chinese kind of political platform. And this guy, Michael Sata of the Patriotic Front, the opposition party, has just won the election 2 weeks ago in Zambia. And he sort of articulated a very popular sentiment there that I termed resource nationalism. And basically the idea was that, you know, he sort of articulated this popular discontent, saying that the Chinese came to exploit us. They treated us like slave laborers. And it's not just in Zambia, it's from Cape to Cairo. The analogy there was the Chinese were the horse, and we're the horse and the Chinese are the rider, and it's always in favor of the Chinese. So these are really colonialist kind of rhetoric that this guy tried to articulate. So there is underground in the lived experience of Africans that there is a real Chinese problem, a labor problem. And I want to take this issue seriously in the sense that I want to take their experience seriously because oftentimes people's lived experience, although it is constructed, oftentimes offer us a very important window into a larger system of power. And the analogy here is to think of Karl Marx, how he understood capitalism in his lifetime. He started out in capital with a very simple and mundane experience that everybody living under capitalism can understand, and that is the experience of commodity. We go and shop and we feel like we're free agents exchanging our labor for salary. And that is the kind of equality and freedom in the market that he started out to understand a gigantic system of grotesque inequality and exploitation. And so I want to do the same in a sense that I want to look at Chinese labor issue and try to unravel why people think that the Chinese are the worst employers. Even though my survey that I'll be reporting to you today suggests that basically all foreign investors do similar things on the ground, and why the Chinese were singled out and targeted and criticized. And I think that has a lot to do with the kind of uniqueness of Chinese capital is peculiar behavior in Africa. So what I would be suggesting to you today is that amongst foreign investors, they share a lot of things in common. And the Chinese are just part of that system of capitalism that we're seeing emerging in Africa today. However, there are indeed some uniqueness in terms of the behavior of the Chinese capital, and I'd like to flesh that out a little bit based on what I found. I just want to give you a disclaimer here. My study is just at a very beginning stage, and I found something that is interesting I'd like to tell you, but I don't have all the answers. Some of them are conjectures, and I hope you will bear with me. So the basic question that drives my research, this will be a long-term project, but I think it's important enough that I want to follow the development of it. It is the question of what is the peculiarity of Chinese capitalism. And basically, the question I have is not to look at the quantity of investment, because that's not what capital is about. If you have a lot of money, you put it under your pillow. That's not capital. You have to make it move. You have to engage people, make it profitable. So we should, instead of looking and tracing the just enormous increase in the amount of capital that we find from China to Africa, we should be looking at class relations. We should be looking at the regimes of production that shape class relations and conflicts. And the second questions we want to look at is the mechanisms of power and resistance. And rather than presume that the Chinese, because they have money, they will be able to dominate Africa as if African sovereign states have nothing to do or cannot intervene to shape what the Chinese can do, and likewise with African workers. And to do that and to answer these two questions, I think something has to be done, and it has not been done, not often enough at least, is the idea of comparison. People who are interested in China and Africa, they look at Chinese firms only. And to do that, you can't really disentangle what is Chinese and what is capitalist. Because you look at Chinese firm and you say it's because they're Chinese. It could also be because what they're doing is just capitalist, Chinese or not. And in order to really answer what is peculiar about Chinese capital or capitalism, we need a very rigorous kind of comparative methodology, and to have comparison first between the Chinese and the non-Chinese investors in the same industry, hopefully in the same country. That would give you the most analytical, theoretical leverage. And I think also important is to compare more historically the political economy today, especially since the 1990s, and the one that happened right after independence or even pre-independence. And then we'll see some of the logics that would produce a peculiar kind of Chinese capitalism that is now active in Africa and many other parts of the world, but you can't do every part of the world, so I'm doing it in Africa. And I've chosen Zambia as what I call a theoretically critical case for several reasons. It is the largest copper producer in Africa, and we know, China is very interested in mineral resources, the extractive industry, so that's the logical place for me to start. The second is that China is also very dominant in the second most important industry across the continent in Africa, and that is construction. I think people oftentimes underestimate the importance of construction industry for underdeveloped countries. They need infrastructure for other kinds of investments to come in and for other kinds of manufacturing or services industries to develop. And it in itself is very labor intensive, and so it provides employment opportunities for very kind of lowly educated and low skilled labor. And so for the country, for many countries in Africa, it is very important. But the Chinese are very dominant, and they sort of have wiped out many other kinds of firms once they come in the past 10 years. So in Zambia, it has this kind of condition that will allow me to look at a more general trend. But even more important than all these two reasons is the third reason, that China is making Zambia the hub of the entire southern African regions. Zambia, I'll show you the map in the next slide. You can see borders many countries in the southern Africa that is very rich in minerals. And that's why they are building a special economic zone that has been leased to the Chinese for 99 years. It will be a privately run zone. The Chinese company, a developer, a state-owned company from China, is running the zone, responsible for attracting investment in and for building infrastructure, housing, and I'll show you the picture later. But it will be the first of at least five, it could be more, of this kind of Chinese-run special economic zones in Africa. So it will be a prototype. And by looking at the kind of conflicts and the kind of negotiations that are going on between the Chinese and the Zambians, I hope I could be able to unravel some of the dynamics between what are the limitations to Chinese power going into Africa. So these are the three major reasons. I'm going to skip the fourth. So the design here is the entire bigger, sort of the big picture will be there are three forms of Chinese investments that I'll be looking at. Construction, and I will present this part today, comparing Chinese, South African, and Zambian construction firms. And then copper mining. Copper mining is even more globalized and internationalized, and I will be comparing the Chinese, the Indian, and the Swiss mines. All these companies have come to Zambia after neoliberalization imposed by the World Bank and IMF, and is really a rainbow collection of countries, and so is really good for academics who want to do comparative research. It's not just the Chinese, although the media reports only focused on the Chinese. The Indians actually own the largest mine on the copper belt, And the most high-tech mind